BlueAnon is a real thing and is alive and well, and the conspiracy theories that emerge from it, which are obviously conspiracy theories and very obviously baseless, are allowed on Twitter, because conspiracy theories are only disallowed when they don't fit the narrative. Dear FBI, I know you don't need advice from a soap opera star, but having been in 10 or 10,000 implausible storylines in my 37 years, may I recommend digging up Ivana. Clearly it didn't take 10 pallbearers to carry a liposuction 73-year-old who, methinks, was in her weight in classified documents. 107,000 likes, 17,000 retweets, 2,700 quote tweets. So, I'm your resident right-winger here, I guess, and an expert in that field. The entire right wing has already long disavowed QAnon as baseless conspiracy theory. And the tiny, 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 pathetically small fringe that actually accepts these positions are an actual fringe in the right wing, and these are people that go through the proverbial cleaning of house within the proverbial right wing, which is why even the most ardent Trump fans and MAGA cult followers do not subscribe to QAnon. It's also why if Q, him or herself or whoever it winds up being, actually put out a post that was like this and was this implausible and was this completely baseless and was as obviously a conspiracy theory as this, you wouldn't see a post like that anywhere, not even on 4chan, get 107,000 likes. And yet, here we are with some BlueAnonery that the left wing has fully mainstreamed and has fully adopted. The QAnoners in the right wing are outcasts, and that's coming from the right wing. Cope and seethe, lefties, we actually clean house, you don't. I'm also the resident cemetery expert, having run one for 4 years, having worked at one for 7 years, having been part-time for years before that, and even though we've parted ways, my mother is still the secretary and treasurer there. My grandfather was the president for years before that. My mother's been the secretary and treasurer for over 20 years and is still there, and they still call upon me for advice, and they still ask questions of me, and I've even had to go so far as to fill in for them as recently as last week. I've been the one to maintain these cemeteries, to install the foundations and footings that go underneath these markers. I'm the guy that's been to dozens of cemetery seminars, workshops, expos, trade shows. I'm the guy that's performed the actual burials for hundreds of members of the deceased, and I've even performed 2 disinterments. I've traveled the country for this industry. I've talked to hundreds of people who are in the field. I've worked with dozens and dozens and dozens of vendors and with thousands of family members who are interested in this field, either as genealogists, as potential clients, as potential vendors. You're not going to find somebody who's more of an expert in this extremely niche field than the one you're seeing on camera right now. So let's go ahead and go through this BlueAnon tweet thread. May I say, this is a brilliant tweet. There is something wrong with this whole situation. Why would Trump bury his first wife on the first hole of a golf course that he owns? Other than tax implications, this whole thing stinks. So here in Connecticut, the rules are pretty strict on burials. And when it comes to private cemeteries, public cemeteries, and simply burying deceased in your backyard, which technically you can do, but you have to jump through hoops to make that happen. You have to own an awful lot of land, and they have to be a very direct relative. And then there's still a limit to how many people you can bury in your backyard. And if you're not going to meet those criteria, then you do have to file as a formal cemetery, which is a very rigorous process. However, Mar-a-Lago's in Florida, where the rules regarding cemeteries are a lot less strict. Pause for correction. The thread made it seem like Ivana was buried at one of Trump's golf courses in Florida, especially the Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach, which is a mere 10-minute drive from his estate at Mar-a-Lago. She's actually buried at Trump's private golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey. None of this changes any of the points I'll be making about normal burial and funerary practices, or the transportation of human remains across state lines, or that the rules of burial in other states might be less strict than here in Connecticut, but I'll do my best in editing to correct these minor mistakes. If I miss something that doesn't detract from the point, deal with it. And in this case, it may be a situation where, since he lives in New York and has spent the entirety of his life until just a few years ago in New York, Donald Trump was probably somebody who had no place to bury his relatives, and in this case, it would be perfectly understandable for him to say, I've been excoriated from every cemetery in New York, and if I want my family to be able to just have immediate, easy access to, in some cases, their mother, then the only way we're going to be able to get away with this is to just do it at Mar-a-Lago, Bedminster, New Jersey. Here in Connecticut, it's actually really commonplace, even to this day to a certain extent, for farmers to bury their relatives on the family cemetery that's on their private farm. And a huge part of that is the tradition of carrying on the farm in what it does, and more so, simply the idea of being close to your deceased relatives. In fact, every disinterment that even came proposed to me, though we only approved 2, I had to field lots of proposals. Every single time that this was the case, it was because somebody had moved very far away, and in almost every case to Florida, and what they wanted to do was disinter the body and move the body cross-country down to Florida, down the entirety of the length of the eastern seaboard, so they could be closer to their relatives. I don't see this as anything other than there's 8 million other Occam's razor, Hanlon's razor, non-nefarious reasons for this to be the case, that you would bury somebody at your gigantic piece of property in Florida, Bedminster, New Jersey, where you have some privacy, where guys like Eric Trump can go see his own mother and not have to deal with the hordes because of the name that comes along with this celebrity. For the record, too, when it comes to celebrities and burials, things get a little bit different than what you would normally experience, say in the case of the folks watching this video right now. So it's entirely plausible that in the case of Ivana Trump, the reason Donald Trump buried her on his property was for that intimacy and was for that privacy for his kids, so they could see their mother, so they could visit and mourn their mother at her actual gravesite, and to have a place to do that. I mean, even if we're not to apply Occam's razor, even if we're just to say Donald Trump bad, Orange Man bad, even if we're to say that there's some sort of nefarious reason, it could be just simply something as much as he's an egotist and he wants everything to be done under his watch. He is Robert De Niro's character from Casino. He's obsessed with control of the things in his life. Again, there's 100 million much more obvious and much more reasonable rationales here that aren't being considered because Orange Man bad. Therefore, instead of applying the principle of charity and assuming even one iota of good faith, let's jump to the worst possible thing and then demand the FBI dig up somebody's remains. She was cremated. 10 pallbearers carrying a heavy coffin. What was in there? Why bury ashes in a coffin? You can have a headstone and bury the ashes in some other container and still have a stone memorial for her. Or let the kids have some to spread or keep as they wished. We did this all the time. For normies. Even for normies. There are people that wanted to have a casket-style funeral. That's the type of burial service they wanted to have, just from an optic standpoint. So we routinely buried a coffin that contained, really in terms of human remains, nothing more than cremated remains. This is extremely common practice. In fact, we buried on multiple occasions, we buried caskets with multiple cremated remains, where it was a husband and wife pair, or where it was a body inside a casket, and then also 2 cremated remains inside that casket. This happens all the time. And again, when you're dealing with multi-gajillionaire celebrities, there is something of an image to uphold. So it would be wildly unexpected for Donald Trump to not have a casket service for his former ex-wife. It would be pretty unexpected for Ivanka and Eric Trump to not bury their mother with a casketed service. In fact, it wouldn't just be common for these situations to come up. Given their celebrity and zillionaire status, it would be the accepted and given norm, even if she was cremated, for her remains to be buried inside of a casket for the purposes of keeping up the appearances of a casketed service. We'll get to the pallbearers and the heft of the thing in just a second. She was cremated, so what's in a casket? Cinder blocks, bricks. This happens all the time. If you just have an empty casket with the 1 or 2 pounds of an urn or cremated remains, which are probably in a plain black plastic box, the lowering device won't properly lower the casket. You need more weight. So funeral directors very routinely in these circumstances put a few cinder blocks in the casket. They don't just do that, by the way, at the absolute last minute for a few reasons, not the least of which is the keeping up of appearances in the sense that the funeral director doesn't want to run into the situation where, say, one of the children in this case wants to hang around and watch the casket get literally lowered into the ground. In that circumstance, you wouldn't want to see the funeral director opening the casket and then physically putting in cinder blocks or bricks to weigh the thing down so it actually lowers into the vault properly. The other problem that you have is that because all of these caskets are going into vaults, which are just giant concrete boxes that are in the ground, what tends to happen is these vaults get permeated. Water gets in there, and then what happens? Well, what happens is the casket floats. The casket will float with or without a body inside the vault, which puts upward force on the lid. And this could cause some real and serious problems down the line that I've personally experienced when this situation arises. So in certain cases, what we've actually done when we're dealing with a waterlogged burial site is we've had the casket in a vault that's above ground, and then we put the lid on the vault above ground, and then use several ratchet straps to hold the lid down while we then lower the vault into the inundated ground. Additionally, when you're carrying the casket, it's really, really painfully obvious watching from the outside if the casket itself is empty because of the weight of the thing. So what funeral directors will do very often is right before they put the casket into the back of the hearse, they'll put the casket in the back of a hearse in a garage, which is where they'll put in the bricks or the cinder blocks. And then what that does is when they get to the burial site, the pallbearers lifting the casket look like they're lifting some heft. It looks like they're lifting an actual body. And when it comes to the Trump family, who are zillionaire celebrities, who again are probably going to be looking to keep up appearances, they probably wouldn't have an empty casket, not only for the practical reason of the lowering device won't properly lower it into the ground, so you have to put weight in there, and the appropriate time and place to put weight in there is before you actually get to the point where the pallbearers are loading up the casket onto the grave site and onto the lowering device. Additionally, when they're carrying it, you want it to look like they're carrying it. I'm not saying you would. I'm not saying that it should. I'm saying that when it comes to these celebrities and zillionaires, this is the image they're trying to create when cameras are everywhere at this service. And again, for the record, this is all extremely common. Exactly who are these people carrying said casket? I mean, I worked in the industry. I've never seen a casket where the pallbearers weren't the deceased children or relatives. Fell down the steps my ass, this stinks to high heaven. You know who pleads the fifth? The mob. I've been a pallbearer hundreds of times. Have I had hundreds of my direct relatives die on me? No. What I was the cemeterian who was on hand to help the family carry the casket onto the lowering device and to the burial site. This is not just extremely common. This is today, because of how many people have left Connecticut, this is the norm. What we normally run into, at least where I operate, is you get a very small attendance and almost everyone is elderly. So the funeral home and the funeral director provide pallbearers where the family doesn't have anybody to volunteer for that service. And then sometimes the cemetery operators are given the wave to help carry the casket from the back of the hearse to the burial location. Again, this is extremely common. As far as there being 10 pallbearers in this case, it would make sense then that if there were only 4 or 5 members of Ivana's family who were willing to volunteer for that duty, you'd have stand-ins. And not just from the practical sense of things, but also from the sense of seat fillers. Again, to keep up the appearance of having the thing fully occupied, having the rails that are on the side of the casket that are designed for carrying it as pallbearers fully occupied. Not to mention, this casket, from my estimation of things, is more than tens of thousands of dollars. It's probably in the area of $100,000, maybe even more. And as a funeral director, the person basically that's acting as the guarantor of that casket, you'd be a complete moron to not have as many pallbearers as you could possibly get your hands on onto that casket. Not to mention, the pallbearers from the family that have volunteered to perform that service, yeah, you don't know what their physical strength is. You don't know what their familiarity is with carrying a casket like this. And they're probably not just carrying it 6 feet from the back of the casket to a burial site. It's probably a decently long carry. And it would make sense then, as a funeral director, to say, you know what, we're only going to have 6 of Trump's family as pallbearers, and then 4 of my guys are going to be there to fill in, because again, I'm the guarantor of that $100,000 casket. As far as Trump's family is concerned, for those of you who are saying, well, Donald Trump really couldn't find 10 immediate family members to be those pallbearers? Again, number one, as the funeral director, I'm putting at least 2 of my guys on as pallbearers anyways because of how expensive that casket is that I'm guaranteeing. And number 2, it's Donald Trump at his private estate. It's entirely plausible that he couldn't find 10 volunteers to carry the casket, which, by the way, have to be volunteers. So in the case of military funerals and military honors, for example, it's actually not exactly common that family members are the direct carrier of the casket, because in the case of, say, somebody who died in combat, it's really hard for the family to bring themselves to perform that service. It's really hard for the family members to bring themselves to be literally carrying the American flag draped casket of their son, in many cases, who died in combat, in almost every case overseas. I know this because we did that. The first funeral I ever did was Jason Lewis, who was a member of the U.S. SEALs, who died in combat in, I believe, the Iraq War, and in attendance were hundreds, if not thousands of people and hundreds of their vehicles. Not one person who carried that casket was a direct member of Jason's family. And his mother, who I know personally, Jean Mariano, couldn't bring herself to getting near the casket until it was placed at the final resting place and on the lowering device. I'm aware that this isn't a military funeral. The point is that there are lots and lots of instances where people simply can't bring themselves to being the pallbearer in this situation, in the same way that my employees couldn't bring themselves to assisting me with the kind of gross aspects of the disinterments we performed. Hell, I'll go so far as to say, as far as I've never seen a casket where the pallbearers weren't the deceased children or relatives, it was rare in all of the burials I performed, which again, hundreds of them, where a casket was what we were burying. It was rare for all of the pallbearers to be direct relatives. And in fact, the norm was that either the funeral home would have to provide at least 1 or 2 pallbearers, or we, as the guys digging the hole and filling it back in, had to be substitutes and stand-ins to get the casket onto the lowering device. Admittedly, falling down the stairs seemed so 70s. Then burying a casket in his backyard didn't hit right. Dig it up and check it. I'm not here to talk about how Ivana died. I am here to talk about how cemeteries operate and what's common when it comes to burials. And in this case, he's talking about it being weird that somebody would do the thing that every human being did on their farms for all of human existence until about World War II. It was here in Connecticut, one of the most densely populated states in the country, the norm for farmers to have a burial site, something of a cemetery funeral on their farm. If she was cremated, why do they have that large, coffin-sized plot on the golf course? I've never heard of such a thing. The whole thing is beyond creepy, because they're burying a coffin with cremated remains in it. And that's extremely common. We did at least 2 or 3 of those every single year. And in fact, if I'm being very cautious with that estimation, and it was probably more like 4 or 5 every year, caskets that came in that didn't have a body in them. Again, this is extremely common, especially for the extremely rich who can afford to have that casket on top of the cremation and who are celebrities and at a funeral where there's going to be cameras everywhere, want to keep up appearances, if you will, and thus have the image of the coffin, and that's why they wind up burying a coffin inside that vault. F your tax breaks, and let me be buried with some dignity. Only really including this so you guys can see what the plot looks like. When my husband was buried, the ground was flat, and he was in a vault in a casket. Then they immediately put grass on it. It took weeks to get his headstone, and this was in 1985. Not literally overnight. Almost like they had it in advance. Yes, they're gajillionaires. All of this stuff happens in advance. They'd be stupid not to do it in advance. The price of these things increases ahead of inflation. The rate of increase of the price of the funerary industry is greater than inflation. You'd be stupid if you have the money now to not take care of that now. In fact, I can name names right here in New Milford Center Cemetery. My grandmother and my grandfather had a headstone purchased something like 15 years before they died, had it installed at their burial site, again, 15 years before they died, and had their names and birth dates etched into the stone 15 years before they died. That means that when it comes time to actually bury them, we can call up the local monument dealer and they can send a guy with a sandblaster to go inscribe the new dates in a matter of an hour or 2. So for a billionaire with the most basic bitch in stock stone that you're ever going to be able to get your hands on, to have managed to turn that around overnight, that's what you would expect. It would be sus if that wasn't the case. In all likelihood, this stuff was purchased years in advance. The name and birthday were already etched into the stone. And then when it came time to bury Ivana, by the way, which couldn't possibly have happened overnight because of how the cremation process works, it probably took, since it's in Florida and coming from New York, days, if not weeks, to turn around to convert a newly dead body to a box full of cremated remains, let alone make all of the purchases that were necessary to bury a casket with those cremated remains in the ground. This probably took a matter of at least a week or 2. So to suggest that the stone couldn't be etched, which takes about an hour or 2 if you get a sandblaster, and on the most basic bitch stone that was definitely in stock at the monument dealer's location. So again, when it comes to the headstone, yeah, it's cheap. Yeah, it was cheap, and it looks like it was a pretty petty move on Trump's part to use the cheapest possible stone he could get his hands on. But again, if that's what you're going to purchase, then you would expect all of this to get turned around extremely quickly. And it would be super, super sus if it wasn't already available. As far as the sod is concerned, no, I wouldn't expect to have the guys fill it in with soil and then magically snap their fingers and the sod's rolled out and ready to go. I would imagine that as the stone was setting, as everything was taking place, as the flowers are still fresh on the grave, the guys that were performing the service probably gave time for the people that were obviously still there, otherwise this picture couldn't have been taken, to perform their mourning before they rolled the sod out and went through the blunt instrumentation that takes place when you perform this type of burial. Not to mention, the sod is probably going to be Bermuda grass. It's probably going to be Tifton 419. Pause again. She's buried in Bedminster, New Jersey, not Florida. So the sod is probably some sort of turf-type tall fescue designed for the out-of-bounds areas of athletic fields and golf courses. This does not change anything regarding common practices with sod installation at a golf course. And they probably don't have it on hand and would probably have to go out and get it. And in this case, sod is something you have to lay the day you get it. And on top of that, if you're getting it for the golf course, why would you get the like 5 or 6 pieces you'd need for a grave when you pretty much have to buy an entire pallet of it all at once and you're a golf course? Wouldn't you just wait until the golf course is doing its sodding in the fall, which it does in the fall? You're not going to go do sod in the heat of July, right? You're going to lay that sod towards the end of the year. You're going to be doing that in October or November, September or October in New Jersey, because that's just what makes sense. So in all likelihood, it stayed bare dirt, as it does here in Connecticut when we can't get our hands on sod, as it does here in Connecticut when you bury somebody in winter and you're just waiting for a day in spring when it makes sense to do that. No, this is extremely commonplace. And in fact, even in Florida, you don't always roll the sod out right away, especially if the place where it was being buried, which is probably not on the physical golf course itself, it's probably some out of bounds area where you don't have the absolutely perfect Versailles maintenance of a billionaire's personal private golf course. Yeah, no. So in that case, I'm not at all surprised that somebody was able to take a photo of the grave where the sod hadn't yet been rolled out. When my son died 5 years ago, the cemetery gave us a simple stone like this, while the fancy permanent one was made. I doubt this was her permanent marker. How about that? A rational and reasoned and not Looney Tunes response to all of this. Yes, whenever you bury somebody where the stone isn't already ready to go in advance, there is going to be a temporary marker in place. Here in Connecticut, most commonly, that's some cheap little piece of aluminum that you just jam into the ground. But when you're a zillionaire and you can afford to just have the monument dealer, hey, take one off the shelf, take one basic bitch granite stone off the shelf and engrave it for me quick, because that's the one that you can engrave overnight and in an hour. Yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable explanation, which suits Occam's razor way more than there's some sort of nefarious activity taking place here where he's hiding nuclear secrets in Ivana and his ex-wife's casket that he's hiding in there so that he can't access them or sell them. God. I'm a mortician. It legit takes months to get a headstone place. Hell, a lot of the granite takes months itself to be mined. Even getting final date lettering, if they had the entire marker already made, save for the dates, takes a few weeks to complete. Fishy. No. I don't believe this guy's a mortician. I don't believe this guy works in the cemetery industry at all. I think that this is just a lie. And here's how I know that. Again, it takes about an hour or two in one of these basic bitch stones to get the rubber mat laid out, to get the hood brought out, and to get the sandblaster that then blasts that rubber mat so you could get some basic bitch lettering installed on this really basic bitch stone, which would have been the easiest thing in the world to engrave. There's no way this took anything more than an hour for that guy to do. They probably had the guy in the shop, and they probably went to a huge monument dealer with their infinite supply of money and said, get us a marker, lickety split, and they did it. None of this is fishy. The number of times where I've gotten a funeral phone call on Monday where we buried somebody on Friday and the engraver was there to finish the dates on the stone on Wednesday, I couldn't keep track of. Virtually every burial where it was the case that we weren't turning them around literally overnight. And we only got one of those a year because the only time that that's the case is when you had an extremely Orthodox Jew who wants to adhere to the extremely Orthodox Jewish tradition and thus be in the ground within 24 hours of death, save for the Sabbath. That was every single time, right? I can't tell you the number of times where we had a headstone and we had the name already engraved and we had the birth date already engraved, and the funeral director called us on Monday and said they want to have a funeral on Friday, and the monument dealer sent out the subcontractor who then brought the sandblaster and engraved the stone on Wednesday. This was the expected norm. And given the circumstances and given the wealth of this family, it would be extremely sus if it wasn't on there in time. So it turns out that Ivana died on July 14th, 2022 in New York City. And this service that you guys have seen photos of took place in New York City on July 20th. That's 6 days between death and burial. So 2 things to add to this. When she dies because of, quote, blunt impact injuries to the torso after falling downstairs at her home, and this happens in New York City, where you have a DA and a prosecuting attorney that are just totally Trump derangement syndrome, harassing Donald Trump at every opportunity they possibly can. If you don't think that there was some sort of serious investigation in those 6 days into her death, you're just not acting in good faith. You're just lying to me. And in those 6 days, if you're going to have that sort of investigation, when you have the state step in and say, hold on, we're going to have our coroner come in and determine the cause of death, and this happens all the time when we're dealing with deaths like this, there's no way there would have been time to turn around a cremation, which means that when it comes to that casket, her remains were almost certainly, her body was almost certainly in that casket. It would be remarkably sus if they weren't. It would be remarkably sus if after the investigation that definitely had to have taken place, they managed to turn around a cremation in 6 days. That just doesn't happen in this industry. I realize money talks, and I realize that in New York City, you have way, way, way more crematoriums than you do, say, in the entire state of Connecticut. And I realize that with the number of people that are in New York City, you have to have the resources and the infrastructure to hurry up and turn around a funeral, especially with the number of Hasidic and Orthodox Jews in the area. Although it's plausible that they managed to turn this around, I think the smart money is the images that you're seeing at her funeral of that casket are a casket that has a body in it. And I'd even go so far as to guess that given the expense of that casket and the money that was spent on it, it's probably an extremely dense wood, and the casket, even being devoid of any body inside of it, probably weighs an awful lot just because it's some incredibly dense wood that costs a lot of money. Again, basic bitch caskets, the one that the broke family down the street is going to be buried in what we would call a pauper's funeral. Those caskets will not lower the lowering device properly unless you put some weight in them. But if we're talking about an extremely heavy casket to begin with, then that would explain all of this. And you wouldn't have to go to any sort of nefarious activity. And you wouldn't have to have any of these other very reasonable rationales for all of the complaints that everybody's considering sus. This even makes this even less suspicious because, to me, it looks like the reason she was cremated was because transporting bodies across states is a red tape pain in the ass, aside from incredibly expensive, which Donald Trump could afford. But it does mean jumping through preposterous hoops to get that to happen legally, which means that the way you transport human remains across state lines, and this happens all the time, and this is something I dealt with in Connecticut all the time, is you get them cremated because the laws regarding the transportation of cremated remains are almost non-existent. Whereas the laws regarding the transportation of a body inside of a casket are really, really stringent and probably make it impossible for him to get that body to his private golf course without cremating her. And if you've bought the casket for the funeral and you're going through all of that effort anyways, you're not going to have a rental. In that circumstance, Donald Trump is going to buy the casket. And if he's going to buy the casket and have the cremated remains, of course he's then going to bury the casket instead of just the cremated remains. What's he going to do with that casket otherwise? What are you going to do with the casket other than bury it, right? So this becomes even less suspicious knowing that she died in New York City, had her service in New York City, and that her remains were transported to Florida, Bedminster, New Jersey, which is both still really close to New York City and is spitting distance from the Trump family's now alternate estate. And again, maybe Donald Trump is being something of a cheapskate because he's burying her on his own property. because it costs an awful lot of money to bury somebody, even if we're talking just cremated remains. It costs an awful lot of money to bury somebody at a cemetery. And you know what? It's not going to be a martyrdom site. It's not going to be a place where crazy radical leftists can go harass Eric and Ivanka while they're trying to mourn their recently deceased mother. Nah, just have it on my property. That way, again, Eric and Ivanka can just mourn in peace on my property. F off TMZ. F off MSNBC. F off all of you paparazzi that are going to be harassing my family while they're trying to mourn the death of their mother. I work in construction, and it's not hard to get stone, especially a black piece of granite. If you ever need help getting your hands on it, let me know. Your vendors must be terrible. Okay, just to clear things up, that's not the case. We're going to talk about cemeteries in general real quick here, now that we've gone over basically the entirety of the conspiracy theory and put it to bed, I hope. But this is something that most people don't understand. The granite that is used for headstones and for markers in cemeteries is of a much higher grade than what you can get in the construction industry, than what you would use for, say, a granite countertop. Much higher grade. In fact, virtually all of it in the United States is mined out of a handful of mines in Barre, Vermont, where you have this extremely high grade of granite that sells for a hell of a lot more than what you're going to wind up paying for a granite countertop, and it shows. I was going to include a photograph of the worst headstone in the cemetery I oversaw, where the person who was doing this insisted on going to his buddy's construction company, insisted on going over my head to the board of directors to get approval for this stone that didn't match any of our rules or criteria. And again, it was of a grade that was of significantly lower quality than the stones that are there. And the engraving, of course, was of significantly lower quality than what is normally used in this industry. And the result was an ex-wife who had to bury her 22-year-old daughter who overdosed on fentanyl with the worst headstone in the cemetery, and it was painfully obvious. And a mother who came into my office crying because she was so embarrassed for her child, for her daughter, for the type of stone that we as a cemetery association actually approved and should never have approved. So to be clear, the granite that's used in cemeteries is of a much higher grade than what's used in construction. And the reason is obvious, and that is that this thing has to last for eternity. Not for 30 years, not for 50 years, eternity. Outside, exposed to the elements. Final thing in all of this, just so people know, this isn't related to the meme and the BlueAnonery that's taking place here and the conspiracy theories of the left that are perfectly allowed and commonly adopted by the left because it fits the narrative. Cremated remains aren't actually ashes. When you go through a crematorium, what you're going through is an incinerator process. You have natural gas nozzles that shoot this blindingly hot flame onto the body, and the ashes do what they do under any circumstance. If you just had a block of wood there, the ashes go up. They go up into the air. Now, I don't know exactly what happens once they go upward. I'm pretty sure they have a ventilation system where they have catches, where they have filters and all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't get left in the crematorium chamber. And I would imagine a lot of it winds up getting ventilated after filtration just into the air. This is what happens when you have a campfire. If you have a campfire where you only have a few logs, most of that ash is just going to go up into the air. And then what's going to be left is kind of a broken, papery substance that doesn't look like what you're going to get when it comes to the cremated remains. Usually the way it goes is the cremated remains are inside of a plastic bag, clear plastic bag, and they have a bronze medallion in them to identify the remains. And then that clear plastic bag gets basically zip-tied shut or twist-tied shut, stuffed into a plain black plastic box that's not much smaller than a shoebox with a label along the side, and then that gets shipped out. And then if the funeral home or if the person who receives the cremated remains wants to, they can then put it in an urn. The black box is technically an urn, and that's what we used to refer to. That's the word we used to refer to it in the industry. But The ornate urns that you see either on somebody's shelf or that get buried in a casket or that get buried directly into the ground, they come from that black plastic box. And in many cases, you simply pull the plastic bag out and you stuff it in there. But those remains, again, they aren't ashes. What they are is, well, what it looks like. A ground up fine powder. It looks like Portland cement. And the reason that's the case is because after you go through that incineration process, there are a few things that manage to survive it. And those few things are little bone knuckles, the nubs at the end of things like your femur. So when you have giant bones in your body, they can actually take something of a beating, and what winds up remaining are the thickest chunks of them that get worked down to the size of, a marble. And then those marbles of bones get ground down into a fine powder, and that's what you wind up getting in terms of cremated remains. They aren't actually technically ashes, and that's why in the industry nobody refers to them as ashes. They refer to them as either cremated remains or the portmanteau of the two words, cremains. Can't wait to see the lefties in the comment section cope and seethe. See you in the next one.